Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Allawi, Chapter 9, Wealth and Poverty. The Problem of Interest. It would, of course, be impossible to reconstruct the basis of an Islamic economy without tackling the problem of interest. For centuries, no scholar of any note would question the prohibition of usury, as it clearly was one of the absolutely reprehensible acts condemned in the Quran. However, the dam was breached when one of the early pioneers of Islamic modernism, Sheikh Muhammad Abduh from Egypt, authorized the payment of interest to savers of the Egyptian Post Office Bank. The argument he advanced, which has formed the basis for all subsequent justifications for decoupling permissible from impermissible interest, was that the Quranic prohibition on riba was limited to a specific form of usury, lending prevalent in pagan Arabia. The practice, in effect, led to the multiplication of debt in the event of payment made late, effectively enslaving the debtor to the creditor. Thus, reasonable interest, which is more of a charge for the use of money, is an acceptable practice if it does not lead to acts of injustice in the creditor-debtor relationship. Of course, Abdu's fatwa on riba or interest did not single-handedly open up the Islamic economic system to conventional banking and finance, but it was a major breach in the ramparts of Islamic orthodoxy on the central aspect of what constitutes legitimate financial dealings in Islam. Over time, the practice of receiving and paying interest, a hitherto furtive exercise whose practitioners were socially ostracized, became commonly accepted in the Muslim world. The boundaries of the fixed and of the changeable in Islam were once more radically shifted in order to accommodate the exigencies of the times. Financial capital and an ever-growing financial sector, which is the hallmark of modern economies, became established in a part of the world which could conceivably have developed alternative systems of financing, production and investment, and of securing people's saving. But capitulation to the world of modern finance was not complete. The fact remained that the utilitarian and historical justification for reconsidering the identity between riba and interest was not entirely convincing. The common person was suspicious of such self-serving arguments, and the attraction of the interest-bearing deposits was still often outweighed by powerful religious scruples. The rise of the Islamic banking movement coincided with the political and social ferment in the Islamic world of 1970s and was primarily driven by lingering public suspicion relating to interest-bearing accounts and the work of commercial banks. It is thus doubly incongruous, even disturbing, that after waiting for nearly a century for the production of financial practices and institutions that reflect the teachings of Islam, the Islamic banking movement, which was the outcome, was subverted for the purposes of financial capital. Legal trickery is what allows Islamic banks to circumvent the appearance of charging interest and shows them to be merely subcategory of conventional banking. A key contract of Islamic banks, the so-called markup financing, is no different from the medieval process condemned by the Church, by which lenders can extract interest from borrowers through a set of interlocking but apparently separate financial transactions. Islamic bankers meeting at their jamborees freely admit that the type of financing they are engaged in is no different in substance or intent from their previous work in conventional banks. At the same time, as the author and critic of Islamic finance, Al-Diwani wrote, small and medium-sized Muslim-owned businesses are offered no Islamic finance facilities at all. When they do finally encounter a financing proposal from an Islamic bank, many of these businessmen quickly become cynical because the financing cost is fixed at the outset of the financing agreement. The academic Charles Tripp also maps out the distortion of the Islamic banking movement as it is lurched away from its initial purpose. As the Islamic financial financial sector grew, mobilizing substantial sums of capital, many of the original intentions faded from view. The goal of reinforcing the bonds of community and the ambition of restoring unity between people's material transactions and the spiritual dimensions of their lives gave way before the need for financial institutions to survive and thrive in a global market dominated by long established and highly competitive institutions, which had historically shaped the rules of the market itself. And the economies of the Islamic world. The Islamic world combines the extremes of wealth and poverty. On the one hand, there are the oil producing countries of the Gulf, whose official overseas assets alone are estimated at nearly $2 trillion. The bulk of these resources is kept in the form of investments in the financial instruments of the developed world, and in particular in US Treasury bills and bonds. The private sectors of these countries also dispose of enormous wealth. The lists of billionaires in the business magazines always include dozens of businessmen from the Arab Gulf countries. At the same time, Muslim countries such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia are crowded with the poor, as more than half of the population often survives on less than $2 per day. These contrasts between fabulous wealth and grinding poverty pose a serious dilemma for the Muslims, which is only partly mitigated by the migration of the poor to the booming economies of the oil producing countries. The countries of the Muslim world are dispersed over a large geographic region. They spread over 3 continents, from Albania in Europe to Mozambique in South Africa, Morocco in North Africa, and Indonesia in the Far East. There are even significant Muslim concentrations in South America. In Guyana, Muslims account for nearly 15% of the population. But even though Muslim countries are well endowed with economic resources in different sectors and have the potential to develop as a vast trading region, they continue to lag behind the rest of the world. With the total population approaching 1.5 billion people, the 57 member countries of the OIC account for nearly 22% of the world's population, but they generate only 6% of the world's GDP and 9% of its total exports. On a purchasing power parity basis, the per capita gross national income of the OIC countries in 2006 reached only $3,600 per annum, compared to the $35,500 in the rich world and an average of $5,600 in the rest of the developing world. The total output, GDP, of the 57 OIC countries in 2007 approached $3.2 trillion compared to a 2007 GDP figure of nearly $14 trillion for the US alone. The entire Islamic economy accounts for less than 23% of the US economy. The output of the Muslim world is less than 10% of that of the West, defined in economic terms as the US and the EU. If the economies of the OIC countries which export fuel are excluded from the tally, the total GDP of the non-oil OIC countries amounted to a paltry $1.9 trillion in 2007. That is less than 13% of the US economy and less than 6% of the economy of the West. The scale of the economic imbalance between the Western world and the Muslim world is glaring. Out of the world's 55 least developed countries, 22 are countries with a Muslim majority, whose economy relies mostly on the production and export of a few non-oil primary commodities. Excluding the special case of the oil exporting countries, most Muslim countries are heavily indebted to outside creditors. The World Bank ranks 33 out of the OIC's 57 countries as moderately to heavily indebted, and they include 15 Muslim countries grouped under the heavily indebted poor countries (HIPIC) classification. Inequality between Muslim countries is also heavily skewed. The average income per capita in 14 of the OIC fuel exporting countries is 7 times higher than that in the other 21 least developed OIC countries. The richest Muslim country, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, has an astounding per capita income 200 times that of the poorest country, Somalia. No such variations are remotely evident in the Western world, where the income distribution between the countries is far more even. Only 6 Muslim countries are classified as high income countries, all of them being oil and gas exporters, while the 26 are low income countries and 25 are middle income countries. The least developed OIC countries accounted for the 27% of the overall population of the OIC, but for less than 7% of the OIC output. Out of the 22 least developed Muslim countries, only 3, Yemen, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, are outside Africa. A second group of Muslim countries has been classified by the IMF as fuel exporting countries. They are a mixed bag. At one level, they include Qatar with a population of less than a million and a per capita income of over $70,000 in 2007, and at another level Nigeria with a population of 145 million and a per capita GDP of less than $1,000 in 2007. The largest economy in the OIC countries at present with the ramp up in oil prices is Saudi Arabia, which has a GDP in excess of $400 billion. Turkey is the largest non-oil economy in the OIC with a GDP figure of nearing $400 billion. It is followed by Indonesia at about $375 billion and Iran at about $250 billion. The biggest non-oil exporter in the Muslim world is Malaysia, whose manufacturing sector is well integrated into the global supply chain for electronics and electrical goods. The economic performance of the Muslim world is, in the final analysis, greatly dependent on the performance of a few of its larger economies, especially the oil exporting giants of the Gulf region. But the wide income disparities within the Muslim world are, and the vastly different economic structures that separate the main economies, such as that of Turkey and Saudi Arabia, from the larger number of very poor countries, greatly restrict the possibilities of intra-Islamic economic cooperation. The fuel exporters are all linked to the vast network which comprises the global energy market, while exporters of manufactured goods such as Malaysia are part of a global supply chain which connects their output to the demands of large consumer markets in the developed world. Most Muslim countries are still reliant upon the export of primary products and are at the mercy of price fluctuations in the global commodities market. While sky-high oil prices are helping Muslim oil exporters, they are punishing the many countries in the Muslim world that are net energy importers. This is affecting a whole range of Muslim countries, from Bangladesh to the deeply impoverished Sahelian countries of Africa. The explosion in agricultural prices, especially for oilseeds and grains, also disproportionately affects the Muslim world, which is a net importer of food. It is now only that serious attention is being paid to increasing the scale of intra-Islamic cooperation in the production of foodstuff. The private sector in the Muslim countries has also languished and lags behind others in the emerging markets. Very few companies in the Muslim world have the weight to compete seriously or bring innovations into the global market. Of the 20 largest corporations in the Muslim world, 17 are oil and gas companies, in most cases state-owned. The largest private company in Islam is the Turkish Koch Group, a diversified holding company with revenues of about $35 billion for 2007 and comparatively small by international standards. In fact, Turkish private sector companies dominate the roster of the largest Muslim groups, followed by Saudi, Emirati, Malaysian, and Kuwaiti groups. Most of them grew back on the back of closed markets and state sponsorship, although the degree of government support and protection for the large private groups in the Muslim world has diminished in the past decade. With a few exceptions, Muslim private companies are not market leaders or innovators in global economy and are not serious competitors with the large multinational corporations. The exceptions are in those areas where there has been a definite competitive advantage, for instance, in energy sector or in the case of Turkish companies, international construction. SABIC, a majority state-owned petrochemical business, has succeeded in expanding outside of Saudi Arabia onto the international scene and is now a global player of the first order. Another internationally successful enterprise is Emirates Airlines, and yet another is the telecommunications group Orascom of Egypt and MTC Zen of Kuwait. Sime Darby of Malaysia is an important competitor in the plantations sector. The increasing sophistication of a number of Gulf enterprises, sparked by the oil-driven economic growth in the Gulf region, also bodes well for the rise of the Muslim multinational company on the world stage. But these good signs are still the exception. However, a number of interesting developments are taking place that might augur a new age of intra-Muslim cooperation in the private arena. The vast oil surpluses filtering to the private sector of the Gulf countries are not all being invested in Western capital or property markets, as has happened in the previous oil booms. The growing corporate sectors in the Gulf countries are now directing an increasing part of their funds towards investments in the nearby capital-starved Muslim countries, where they have some advantage over the multinational corporations. These markets are frequently too small or are seen to be too risky for corporations based in the major capitalist countries. Thus, the investment flows from the Gulf countries into markets such as Pakistan, Egypt, and Morocco have grown significantly, giving rise to the regional enterprises with large market shares in the major Muslim countries. For example, the MTC Zen Group of Kuwait is now a major player in the telecommunications sector of a number of Asian and African countries, and the UAE banks are active investors in the banking sector of Pakistan. The rise of large, well-capitalized hedge funds and private equity groups based in the Gulf is also contributing to the flow of investment capital between Muslim countries. These funds and groups are targeting the energy, ports, cements, and the hotel and real estate sectors in a number of middle-income Islamic countries. It is possible that regional cooperation will play a part in the limited reintegration of the major Islamic economies and will succeed where interminable conferences and governmental declarations of intent have failed. Muslim-owned enterprises are also creating a network of alliances through organizations such as the World Islamic Economic Forum and the Islamic Chambers of Commerce and Industry. They are still nascent networks that are no match for the more established World Economic Forum in Davos or the business alliances of global enterprises, but they are promising beginnings. These developments may draw the economies of the Muslim countries together, especially those compromised with the new Greater Gulf co-prosperity sphere, but they are entirely separate from the issue of the revival of the Islamic moral economy. In essence, the growth of the regional multinational company or even the expansion of Islamic banking into many Muslim markets is not entirely synonymous with the revival of Islamic norms of economic conduct and purposes of economic activity. These have been overshadowed by the wholesale adoption of modern capitalist standards for management of economies. It is immaterial to the consumer in Pakistan whether his or her mobile phone comes through the courtesy of an Egyptian or a Norwegian company. Neither does it make much difference if the rules of banking for a Muslim owned bank are exactly the same as for one of the behemoths of international finance. It may provide some measure of pride that at least some of the major sectors of the Islamic economy are controlled by homegrown or Muslim owned enterprises and that these are providing a quality service or a product of quality at fair prices. But the decay of the Islamic underpinnings of economic life still continue apace. Modern corporations, wherever they may be, follow the same broad business objectives. In fact, from a strictly ethical perspective, Western corporations may be far more advanced than their Muslim owned counterparts. The ethics of business are now taught in major business schools throughout the Western world, while corporate social responsibility is a growing issue for international companies. There are few, if any, major Muslim owned corporations that follow the same rigorous standards of ethical conduct which prevail in a large number of multinational corporations. For example, the extensive deforestation in Indonesia and Malaysia is the work of indigenous corporations. Such a pattern of resource exploitation is unlikely to occur with a major multinational corporation that has to answer to government, ethical investors, non governmental organizations, and an irate public. Labor exploitation and the use of child labor are rampant in the private sectors of Muslim countries, which export textiles, sport goods, and footwear. For instance, Egypt, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. No major Western corporation involved in, say, footwear marketing could withstand the criticism and lawsuits arising from its employment of child labor or from its abuse of workers in its overseas factories. Globalization will certainly threaten the possibilities of building an Islamic economy, not because Muslim countries will be excluded from the process, but because they can only be included within the terms of globalization process itself. Thus, apparently, salutary developments such as growth of Muslim-owned corporations and increasing investment flows between Islamic countries may strengthen economic cooperation and build the elements of a market economy in the Islamic world. But they will not by themselves create the basis for regenerating Islam's moral economy and the fundamentally different perspective on economic and financial transactions that this would entail. Certain aspects of globalization process are essential for recreating an Islamic economic space, for instance, the free flow of goods and capital between countries. However, Islam parts company with the globalization process if it means the and purposes of economic activity stray afar from worldview of Islam. The failure of the Muslim world seriously to contemplate a radical departure from the conventional model of economic development has strengthened the hands of the advocates of globalization inside the Muslim world. This distancing of Islam from the ethical dimensions of economic life in the Muslim world will accelerate. There is no unique Islamic currency bloc, no special arrangements to expand and harmonize economic relations between Islamic countries, and no strong commercial organizations that could regenerate Islamic economic life at the business and trade levels. The massive opportunity to do so, which was created by the growth of Islamic banks, has been squandered as the Islamic banking movement surrendered to the expediencies of joining the international capital market. The banks accepted a walk on role in the international financial system rather than building the sinews of a new Islamic financial architecture. The sniggering and timid prevarications that accompany Mahathir's bold call for an Islamic currency constitute another example of a lost opportunity to build essential currency foundations of an Islamic economy. Another prospect to do so is presenting itself with the unprecedented accumulation of financial resources in the Arab oil exporting countries. These can provide the wherewithal for a massive expansion of the range of activities and resources of the pan-Islamic institutions which do work, such as the Islamic Development Bank, perhaps creating a new set of economic institutions to pull the Islamic world together. Simply applying the criterion of zakat, or 2.5% of the net financial wealth of these countries, to the sovereign wealth funds of the GCC oil exporting countries would yield an annual figure of $75 billion in resource transfers to poorer Muslim countries. This would dwarf all the official aid flows presently flowing to these countries. Whether the political and business elites of oil exporting countries will seize this chance is another matter altogether.